There are many types of neurofeedback devices and protocols emerging presently from the field. Although each one claims to be the best, the most effective, and fastest, there is very little research to support these claims. Historically, each approach, no matter how simple, has proven to be effective. There are many eye-catching displays with elevated claims, as well as complex training screens using sophisticated location methodologies to find and train just the right location with a magic bullet approach, which is what brought us such failure with the use of psychopharmacology. Meantime, Walter Freeman is promoting a systems model of EEG analysis with respect to the brain in the neuroimaging community. The protocols with the most support in research literature are the 1 and 2 channel methods first employed in the field of neurofeedback. The new mind protocols are based on these time-proven and effective protocols. They have a track record going back decades, and the new 2-channel format that we've improvised takes the next step. This approach has over a decade of proven success at hundreds of clinics around the world. What's just as important is that the equipment needed to employ them is relatively low cost compared to the exotic models being promoted presently by many manufacturers. In addition, they are simple to set up and to use. This is clearly the best combination for those entering the field of neurofeedback. The 2-channel protocol method we employ also provides the opportunity to do more than just push buttons on a black box. They can be easily understood and form the foundations of the field of neurofeedback itself. There is no substitute for learning the basics, and these protocols provide that opportunity. The emerging paradigms in neurofeedback with regard to protocol selection and implementation are as follows. Training based on clinical experience and diagnosis, or a one-size-fits-all protocol for each DSM category. Training based on symptoms that may be related to a specific region of interest, or ROI, based on Brodmann areas. Training based on symptoms that may be generally related to specific networks as we understand them in our limited fashion, as presently indicated in the fMRI research. And finally, training based on stochastic analysis of the brain as a system. The latter two are the basis for the new mind protocol derivation models. Let's look at training based on diagnosis and clinical experience. The first protocols were developed through trial and error methods to find a protocol for each diagnostic category. The problem with this approach is that the same protocol tended to work for more than one category. The protocol for anxiety might also work just as well for ADD or insomnia or mania. Presently, it is well known that the DSM is deeply flawed and does not agree with the neuroimaging findings of more recent times. Even worse, the QEEG research was showing multiple subtypes of each DSM category. The protocols are based on volunteer samples. The people who come to one clinic may be a different group in many ways than from another clinic, so the approach tends to ignore individual differences. The protocols also tended to be limited to a few favored locations that in the long run were not always optimal. With 19, 10, 20 locations, it's difficult to guess the best one. Next, let's look at training based on fixing the malfunctioning region of interest. This approach attempts to find one key location that is responsible for the symptom or problem behavior. It is an extension of the magic bullet paradigm used in pharmaceutical intervention. If we can just find the one problem spot and fix it, the problem will go away. It will happen fast because we found the one special spot and we're going to make it do what we want. This of course ignores the fact that every key hub or node is embedded in multiple feed-forward and feedback loops of connectivity that help regulate it. The source of dysregulation may be in one of these other loops, and just pushing one area to normalize may not do the entire job. Training based on network analysis is a more recent perspective, which is also being inspired by research in network analysis and diffusion tensor imaging paradigms. It is more consistent with the latest findings and takes into account the feedback interconnectivity model. It still tends to overemphasize the modular aspect of the brain and lacks clear and specific models of location related to function. Walter Freeman has been proposing that the neuroimaging community focus more on the nonlinear dynamical aspect of networks and information processing. This perspective includes the network model, but also accounts for the profound connectivity and complexity of the brain. This perspective relies on a stochastic model of analysis that looks for system dynamics dominated by various attractor basins. Analysis of QEG from this perspective is statistical and looks for various dynamical weak points in the entire system. By methodically testing these weak points, the best locations in the system can be fed back to assist in overall system stabilization and shifts to new attractor states with less entropy and improved signal-to-noise features. As we have said, protocols were initially based on diagnostic criteria in the field of neurofeedback. Below are the peer-review protocols found effective with various disorders. They have related features of uptraining fast waves and training down slow waves, or of stabilizing dominant frequencies such as alpha and SMR. This peer review list was generated by Joe Lubar many years ago and published in the Journal of Neurofeedback. The authors used variations on these protocols, training primarily at C3, CZ, or C4 over the motor strip. They would train using single-channel monopolar protocols. They would train for different time periods on the left or right side depending on the client's response. Beta up and theta down on the left side would increase arousal, and SMR up and theta down on the right side would generate calming. A protocol decision tree based on responses to training and symptoms was developed. This same method continues to be used effectively by large numbers of practitioners today. This approach was adopted by Newmind, and frequency training decisions were based on brain maps as well as symptoms. Instead of training one side at a time, both sides are trained at once. When I published the first Brodmann 1020 correlation by function chart in the late 1990s, some practitioners were beginning to see a value in matching symptom to location instead of just training over the motor strip. The use of QEEG with this new fMRI data regarding Brodmann areas and functions began to gain momentum in the field. Selecting location based on symptom and function expanded training options. Many practitioners noted it helped increase protocol effectiveness. Location was clearly a more important variable than previously considered by many. However, this also began to lead to a kind of electronic phrenology that was too simplistic and did not prove effective. This is clearly because of the nature of networks and system dynamics. As the research on networks grew, other practitioners began to focus on the idea of training large groups of cooperative hubs and nodes related to a function. This approach more clearly and closely reflected the research observations of the time. Here is an example of how a cortical system generating alpha waves compared to a cortical system generating theta waves. The key alpha networks might best be trained by working on locations that interfaced with the cortex, such as the cuneus. Core areas affected by theta are the temporal lobes and the frontal midline. Yet in the literature, theta responds very well to training at the motor strip. And what of focal theta representing deficits of local perfusion? Networks in the brain are developed upon a small world pattern. Rather than being randomly connected or having all neurons connected, there's a group of key rich club hubs that shorten pathways and enhance signal conduction times. A more recent concept is that we could train these influential hubs and nodes. There are three recognized levels of organization: the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. The QEG does not have the resolution to capture micro level activity according to most neurophysicists such as Nunez. We can, however, image the mesolevel, but only the activity of large dipole layers of 60 million neurons. Yet each of these neurons is related to each other in the whole brain by only 3 degrees of separation. This example shows the distribution of axonal activity in a cell column containing large numbers of neurons. Note that each axonal fiber is reaching out to other cell columns and networks. The number of networks each cell column is participating in may be very large. Different groups of these networks may participate in global extended networks that cover many, if not all, 1020 locations. Yet we cannot parse them out and influence them individually with neurofeedback alone. So, it is safe to say that networks transcend Brodmann areas, and that each Brodmann area, at the very least, has many related functions at different levels of influence. Some of them may involve vast numbers of extended networks. Here is an example of how rich club networks are embedded in known fiber pathways. It is unlikely we can determine which pathway affects each individual symptom. It is likely a fool's errand at this point in time with QEEG or Laird technology, especially using only 19 locations to try and achieve this outcome. Fortunately, these networks do converge into general meta-network categories such as auditory salience or default mode networks, but these general networks have vast numbers of functions. However, we can locate them and train them. In 2012, Laird et al. Published his analysis of over 30% of the MRI literature looking at function and location analysis. He found roughly 18 macro networks that participate in major functions of the brain. The interesting thing is that these networks do match up somewhat with the 1020 locations. But what is the best way to train these network hubs? There's also the problem of how do they relate to each other in dynamic function and execution of their specialty areas. Information flows in parallel within each hemisphere, and long delay loops feed back from front to back in both directions. How do the hemispheres coordinate this activity? There are dense interhemispheric networks that seem to dominate this activity. In fact, Gomez and other researchers have found coherence deficits in these pathways are the best estimator of overall brain connectivity. People with mild cognitive impairment experience decline in function in these networks first. Interhemispheric networks have a profound influence on the entire brain. Information also flows generally from back to front along 2 major streams, the dorsal and the ventral. The dorsal tends to flow in each hemisphere along the midline regions, and the ventral along the temporal lobe regions. We have 1020 locations that spatially match these regional flows. We conclude the best way to train these networks is through homologous site pairs such as C3-C4 that match macro network hubs. This also gives us a major influence on intrahemispheric activity as well. So, components of networks cannot yet be identified and monitored using EEG technology at the micro level. We don't yet even know how networks map to the fiber pathways anyways. We are training dipole layers at the meso level that are related by millions of neurons participating in untold numbers of scale-free networks. This is consequently a very messy business. The best we can do in neurofeedback is to train the EEG at influential macro network hubs that influence large numbers of behaviors and symptoms in a very general way. An S-Laird approach from this perspective has limited value, although it may be of use in some situations. Neurofeedback training is going to be different from other methods such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, fMRI feedback, and so on, because as we have shown, it has its own unique characteristics and abilities. If we want to take advantage of all we have learned over the years, we should develop a method of neurofeedback that takes into account what historically has been found to be the best training locations in the macro network community based on clinical experience. It should pay attention to the general functions related to these locations, but not confined by them. It should take into account upstream and downstream feedback and feed-forward influences of the other micro networks. This approach should be using inter-hemispheric homologous sites for maximum influence. The frequencies we train should be based not only on static map measures, but also on dynamic response of the brain to these frequency strategies during training. This means understanding the compensatory activity that occurs between hemispheres in the frequency domain as we train. So, we train on a static network-based model, but looking at intra-hemispheric network dynamics occurring between hemispheres during training. We take into account compensatory processes occurring between frequency domains or component bands that reflect intra-hemispheric inhibitory effects as described by Pascual-Leone. In this process, we monitor horizontal and vertical integration at the network level by looking at hemispheric asymmetry as a measure. We will explain these latter two concepts in more detail shortly. This approach allows for a simple two-channel method that is highly effective and based soundly in existing findings in the neuroimaging literature. To do this, we provide an automated protocol generator that creates standardized protocols whose design is derived from neurofeedback clinical literature. These are applied to locations that are derived from the statistical analysis of all measured QEEG variables. This derivation is a result of inspecting the level of deviance at each location with respect to magnitude, dominant frequency, coherence, symmetry, and phase. The brain is treated as a whole statistical entity that works dynamically together. It is a stochastic model that considers the QEEG as a static measure of a system state. It tallies the cumulative deviance of each location across all of these measures and rank orders the locations according to global level of deviance. Note the rank order of locations listed under the primary z-score locations. These are used to match the compensatory correlate of the other hemisphere based upon the homologous principle of the organization of macro networks. Frequency analysis using the QEEG generates indicators of component bands that are dysregulated, and based on peer review analysis and extensive collective clinical experience from over a decade, the enhancements and inhibits are estimated. Each of the best fit protocols must then be empirically tested using a training session to determine the protocol that generates the most change in the EEG distribution in the expected direction. Horizontal integration is a term we use to describe the presence of the natural asymmetry that exists between hemispheres with respect to magnitude and coherence, or connectivity. These have been established as key measures of emotional and cognitive function respectively, with an emphasis in emotional plasticity. See the research on Gomez and Ingalls that we have published on the site. The vertical integration concept is a term that describes the cooperative efficiency of cortical and subcortical networks. It is a measure of general inhibitory control and is well described by Sturman in his 2006 summary article on EEG and arousal. In a sense, it looks at the processing efficiency and plasticity of the triune brain. It is based on ratios of slow to fast wave activity and reflects perfusion levels as confirmed in the co-registration studies. It reflects the inhibitory control of the cortex with respect to the subcortical structures. Its emphasis is on the external attention system and cognitive performance as a function of arousal measures. The vertical and horizontal domains are non-exclusive and overlap because we are dealing with an integrated system. Emotional activity alters arousal levels and activity in limbic and brainstem regions. This means asymmetrical interhemispheric dynamics influence cortical-subcortical arousal patterns and influence and bias cognitive processes. It is well known how Xerxes Dodson discovered that arousal calls on different network activation, which is in turn reflected in task performance. Horizontal integration also reflects adaptive responses to focal trauma, which can be seen in interhemispheric connectivity patterns. In the example below, under B, a green cross indicates the location of a lesion. The blue lines indicate intrahemispheric reductions in connectivity, in response to focal loss of function, while red lines show encroachment of right hemisphere network influences upon the left in an effort to support left hemispheric function. This is mediated by interhemispheric compensatory mechanisms. The model dynamic patterns are typical of brain network activity. The process of learning related to neurofeedback appears to reflect two major phases of acquiring new behavior, as outlined in behavior theory and discussed by Barry Sturman in his 2008 lecture on neurofeedback and operant conditioning at ISNR. These phases are acquisition and consolidation. Acquisition has its emphasis in Hebbian action at the cell assembly microlevel of processing. Consolidation is more related to long-term potentiation activity, or LTP, wherein networks develop collateral identities reflected in neuronal growth, that is, learning becomes structure. This aspect has been confirmed recently in MRI studies showing neurofeedback alters structure and function of both gray and white matter. We select frequencies to train based on the static map, but through observation of interhemispheric network dynamics in the form of changes in component band activity during neurofeedback training, we adjust thresholds on the fly to indirectly influence cell assembly activity at the micro level, which resonates up to the macro level cybernetic feedback loop. There must be room for compensatory responses with neurofeedback training, and changes in training parameters must be made based on these responses. Plasticity is a critically important component of network reorganization. The brain is self-organizing, and this involves considerable trial and error activity. Some parameters need to go outside the normative ranges, as defined by standard deviations in QEEG and Z-score training. This can readily be observed during training as well in consecutive pre-post QEEG maps. QEEG references should only be used as references and not reified into an expected norm that all individual EEGs should conform to. That is, it may be critical to maintain some individual differences. Z-score training should be applied cautiously, as we do not understand the details of this process in the present state of neocortical dynamical theory. In addition, Z-score databases are normed for passive activity and not training activity. The first graph on the left is an example of the eyes open EEG distribution. The highest amplitude frequencies occupy the lowest part of the frequency spectrum. Delta dominates the EEG skyline, then theta, then alpha, and then the beta frequencies. This pattern shows up on the trend screens as a layering of trend lines representing the different frequencies with delta on top. Training alpha down may indirectly train down beta or high beta because they have been compensating for the alpha activity. This compensatory response occurs between hemispheres as well, particularly when training at homologous sites. In this two-channel example, we are training beta and alpha in both hemispheres, but theta indirectly responds as well in a compensatory manner. The brain tends to train dynamically in this fashion because it is one integrated system trying to maintain a suitable level of allostasis in order to maintain optimal functioning and plasticity. As frequencies shift into their normative range of amplitude variation in the vertical dimension, they also balance left to right in the horizontal dimensions. Alpha becomes higher in amplitude on the right as it normalizes and becomes lower in amplitude on the left. This generates the normal asymmetry of alpha in the brain in the horizontal dimension. Thus, strategically training the brain with two channels in this manner is a highly effective method that provides excellent results by allowing the brain to progressively find self-organized solutions without excessive constraint. For more information on the theoretical underpinnings of this model of training, as well as extensive references, please see my chapter on QEEG in the book entitled Clinical Neurotherapy, Application of Techniques for Treatment, edited by David Cantor and Jim Evans.